Yeah, I think we're ready.
Okay. All right, well, I see more and more people are showing up as we gather together here. My name is Jamie Nolan. I'm the Associate Vice President for Community Equity, and we were Community Equity and Inclusive Excellence, but we're going into becoming Community Equity and Social Justice, which I'm actually really excited about, especially in this moment. And I think today embodies a lot of those qualities, this particular session. But before we really get into it, I'm going to share our land acknowledgement. So W.S. Pullman is located on the homelands of the Nimiipuu, Nez Perce, and the Palouse people, while W.S. Vancouver is housed in the traditional Cowlitz lands. WSU Tri-Cities on ceded lands of the Confederate tribes of the Umatilla, and WSU Spokane on the historical Coeur d'Alene tribal lands bordering with the Spokane tribe. Each of the tribes, Washington has actually more than like 35 tribes, and not all are federally recognized. I think it's also important to note, on the one hand, as a land grant institution, how important the acknowledgement is, but there's a bit of a paradox there, right? Because if you may have seen an article of late that was land grab institutions. So I think what we're beginning to do, like with so many things in this moment, is start to come to terms with our contradictions, right? And all the histories that are denied, so that we can be more whole and we can really move towards the aspiration of some sort of repair of our shared sense of humanity and caring for our planet, which is what today's about, right? So one of the things that really struck me, and you'll hear this as I begin to introduce our panelists, is how truly interwoven and interconnected all the variety of issues that tie us to environmental justice, climate justice. I was recently at a Black Lives Matter march, and I was struck, and one of my actually near and dear colleagues reminded me of this, that economic justice is racial justice, environmental justice is racial justice, climate justice is racial justice, and so on. And Gloria Ladson-Billings, who's an amazing educator, who first actually introduced critical race theory to education, also talked about sometimes we need to back away from even labeling ourselves social justice to just justice. So for me today is all about that. We are also embodying, we are modeling a community of practice model, which is also fantastic. Because I've come to believe in my 30 years of doing the work I do, the only way we're really going to create authentic, meaningful, lasting change is through a community of practice. So today our panelists represent different disciplines, positions, generations, and very lovely, they are a community of practice, practicing today maybe as a group for the first time. So let me begin my introductions. Judy Muth is a retired Washington State professor of critical culture, gender, and race studies. Her work examines how conceptions of nature and the natural impact values and policy regarding the environment and groups of people and drive our interactions with nature and each other. Judy has worked with the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation and regional school districts on several National Science Foundation projects to shift the cultural lens of science education toward a tribal point of view. She has a master's degree in wildlife biology and worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service habitat evaluation and restoration projects in Texas and the Northwest. And she established a K-12 alternative school where students and faculty together design the interdisciplinary and experiential curriculum. Oh my God, I love that. Sorry, I get to do that. Judy currently works with Citizens Climate Lobby to turn climate change around by making a carbon-free and dividend policy in the US a reality. She spends as much time as possible outdoors, me too, running in the Palouse, hiking in the region and internationally, and grows veggies in her own backyard. This is a woman after my own heart. John Lupinacci is an associate professor at Washington State University. He conducts research and teaches in the Cultural Studies and Social Thought in Education program using an approach that advocates for the development of social scholar activist educators. Love that too. His ecological work in education is interdisciplinary and draws from critical social theory through anarchist philosophy, critical animal studies, ecofeminist philosophy, and eco-justice education, while recognizing that many of these Western frameworks are entangled with colonial cultures and thus ought not take precedence over or appropriate diverse indigenous knowledges. Do you ever sleep? Eat? That's a lot, John. Drawing heavily from critical conceptions of environmental education and abolitionist teaching, John's research focuses on how people, specifically educators, educational leaders, and educational researchers learn to both identify and examine destructive habits of Western industrial human culture, and how those habits are taught and learned in schools. His experience as a high school teacher, an outdoor environmental educator, and a community activist artist scholar all contribute to his research, teaching, and development of interdisciplinary research projects open to the impossibilities of unexpected spaces within education and educational research. He's the co-author of the book Eco-Justice Education, co-editor of a scholar activist scene, Major Threat, co-host of a radio talk show, Busted Pencils, and is on the editorial boards for Educational Studies, Critical Education, and Journal for Critical Media Literacy. He was recently recognized by the Washington Education Research Association, WERA, W-E-R-A, and with a research award in 2018. You're already getting really enthusiastic and excited about our panelists, I'm sure. I am. Kara Whitman is an assistant professor at WSU School of Environment and project coordinator for the William D. Ruckelshaus Center, which fosters collaborative public policy in the Coeur d'Alene and Spokane River basins in northern Idaho and eastern Washington. She received undergraduate degrees from North Idaho College and the University of Idaho, master's degree. No, I'm sorry, at the University of Idaho, and her master's and PhD in environmental natural resource science from Washington State University. Go Cougs. As a teacher, Kara uses transformational education strategies for improving scientific literacy for both majors and non-majors in environmental and natural resource sciences, and is dedicated to improving and increasing the use of collaborative public policy to address grand environmental challenges. There's that community of practice model again that faces the Northwest region and the nation. Kara received her Richard G. Law Excellence Award for undergraduate teaching in 2019. In her spare time, she enjoys spending time with her husband and 5 kids. Sorry, that made me tired just reading that. Trailer camping, listening to music, backpacking in the Idaho wilderness, and playing board gaming. She also loves antiquing and finding bargains at garage sales. I want to hang out with all these folks. Matthew Carroll is a professor in WSU School of the Environment. Previously, he was executive director of the International Association for Society and Resource Management. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, a master's degree from West Virginia University's Forest Division, and a PhD specializing in forest and natural resources from the University of Washington. That's okay. The recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship in Ireland, Matthew has worked on numerous projects in the country. He has also worked in several countries, including Madagascar, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Australia, for projects with partners such as the US State Department and USAID. In addition to his research, he's received numerous awards, including the Award for Service on the President's Ecosystem Assessment Team, the National Governors Association Award, manuscript competition given by the Western Resource-Based Communities, and the Award for Extraordinary Service to the Society from the Society of American Foresters. So those are our panelists, and as you could hear, we are all in for a wonderful treat, I think amazing conversation when we get to the Q&A. And we are all just waiting to hear from each of you now. And we're going to start with Judy. You're muted.
Thank
It
you,
happened.
Jamie. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm excited to be able to think about this topic. As you mentioned, it just seems like it becomes more critical every day. Certainly, we've been thinking about those issues locally to globally in this season. So when I was thinking about environmental justice, the comment you made, Jamie, about the fact that it's just justice makes so much sense, because when we think about it, it really means to me equitable living situations for all peoples, and full involvement of all peoples in the analyses of problems, in discussion of those, in decision making, and in implementation of any kind of policy or action that might be used to address those that might eventually result in people's well-being. So this would include, you'd have to think about this. If we address environmental justice, this means that we have to share equitably the benefits of the environment, and if we create harms, we have to share those equitably as well. And we need to prioritize the needs of people who have been most negatively impacted. So that needs to be like the first order of business. And something that often gets lost in, I think, our discussions of social justice and even environmental justice is that we have to be respectful members of the Earth community. If we think of ourselves as a human community and don't think of ourselves as living in an Earth ecosystem, that's the base of everything, then we have pretty much cut off our at the beginning. So we need to back up and consider the health and the well-being of the Earth as well. And most people may be familiar with the difference between equal and equity and equitable, but I wanted to just touch on that because it's confusing sometimes. People think of them as the same, and we have used the word equal for so long before we finally realized that there was a problem with that. Let's say I have a greenhouse and it's full of plants, and plants from all over the world, different kinds of plants, and I give all the plants the same amount of water, and I give all the plants maybe the same amount of exposure to sunlight and the same temperature regime or the fertilizer. Not all of those plants are going to do well, and some, in fact, some are going to be really harmed because I'm using an equal treatment. But if we back up and say, well, what's equity? If we use a human situation that we're really familiar with right now, let's say COVID-19, the death rate in communities of color is much higher than it is in white communities. And that's for a lot of systemic reasons, but one of those is just air quality. So in communities of color, on average, have poorer air quality than white communities. So if we're looking for an equitable situation, we ask those communities, what do you need? What do you want? And we find out, and maybe that means that there's money set aside right away for air filters or air conditioners for that community, because that's what would bring them to an equitable situation. So just wanted to clarify that. And thinking about environmental and social justice, those are always intertwined with all sorts of justice. And it really then pulls into that we're not just talking about air quality or water quality. We're talking about what's going on in your workplace, what's going on in your school, what's your housing like, what is your healthcare like, what is the safety in your community. All of those things are involved in environmental justice. And so it is social justice, environmental justice, and all of them are wrapped up together. And one of the things that we want is this inclusiveness, this bringing of all communities together. And I think about it in terms of this panel, I'm not somebody who has suffered environmental injustice really at all. I study it, I think about it, I work on it, but in terms of bringing all the community into the conversation and having all of the folks, especially those most effective, in the conversation, and that's not happening in this panel necessarily. One problem with that is that at the university, the people who are most impacted, who have the least power, when we recognize that, sometimes we begin to ask them to be on every committee, speak in every class, do the work of educating all the rest of us. So I know there's a hard balance there, but it is really important to try to figure out how do we bring those voices into the forefront. In terms of what we do when we do environmental justice work, one of the things that we really think about is what is the story being told when there's an environmental injustice? What is the normality that's been accepted? And how do we address that? What values are being promoted? Who's defining what the problem is and how? Who gets to decide on the solutions? Who benefits again? Who's harmed? And how do we act to change the status quo? What is the action that we can really put in place there? So for me, my work in environmental justice is fairly broad, but the thing that I'm working on right now is that climate change exacerbates every inequity that exists, whether we're talking about somebody's housing situation or their ability to access food or whatever it happens to be. Climate change is going to exacerbate that. So I have decided to spend a fair amount of my work right now with Citizens Climate Lobby. The kinds of things that we're seeing in the Northwest are really good examples. We have wildfires that are affecting our communities, obviously. And this has immediate ramifications on those who are least powerful. So we want to think about that. Farming challenges in our area because of climate change are serious, they're going to get worse. Water regimen changes have altered the fisheries so that our salmon runs are more endangered than ever. So all of those things are happening, and climate change is a driver, and that's why I'm working on those. So I think I've used up my 5 minutes. I'll pass it on.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the affirming the ways in which climate change exacerbates the inequities that we have had for much like, you know, we were talking about COVID. And it seems like we're at this confluence of all of these rushing rivers where COVID is one current that also then connects to the current of what's happened with Black Lives Matter and racial justice, and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor is a tipping point for that. And then economic and all of those things coming together. And we're standing at this confluence trying to, you know, make sense of it and figure out how we navigate through that. So anyway, thank you. Let's hear from John now.
Thank you, Judy and Jamie. And those comments, Jamie, I think segue really nicely into what I put together here for today for the panel. So before I share a bit on environmental justice, eco-racism, and eco-justice, with some thoughts that I have about the importance of environmental justice related to democracy, and in particular education, I would like to echo and amplify the land acknowledgement, Jamie, that you made at the beginning of this public square discussion, and thank the organizers and those in attendance for the invitation to be participating today. Related to environmental justice, I want to emphasize the importance of humility and having the utmost gratitude and respect as a settler colonial on these indigenous lands, and honoring indigenous permission to have these kinds of conversations that we're having here today. I feel it's important to recognize that diverse indigenous peoples have survived and endured genocide on this continent and abroad, and that beyond any acknowledgement, it's important that we must all continue to work towards decolonial futures. Also, let us acknowledge the family and friends of Breonna Taylor and recognize the immense pain felt today after the grand jury indictment of the police officer who took part in murdering Breonna Taylor. Black Lives Matter, and injustice burns deeply today and will continue to for some time until we do better. A moment of silence for Breonna Taylor. So I'll start with the definition of environmental justice. I like simple definitions, and then we'll build a bit on that. The environmental justice movement is one that highlights how environmental damage, like toxic waste sites, incinerators, large operation meat and dairy farming, and poorly managed forestry, etc., happens often in locations and in ways that disproportionately negatively impact people experiencing life in poverty or in working class or politically minoritized groups. In other words, environmental justice, and especially environmental racism, centers the major problem that privileged communities often overlook. The problem that increasingly, as climate change impacts increase, more and more families unjustly live, go to school, play, and work in dangerously toxic environments. Compounded by racism and classism in this country, we see that Black and brown families, and in particular people experiencing the material realities of poverty in the US, are poisoned from the start on a daily basis. This becomes incredibly important to not only acknowledge, but rethink if we are serious about equity, access, and diversity in our visions of democracy and community. It would be irresponsible of me if I didn't mention the work of Robert Bullard, who wrote that environmental racism, and this is a direct quote, racial discrimination in environmental policymaking, the enforcement of regulations and laws, the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste facilities, the official sanctioning of the life-threatening presence of poisons and pollutants in our communities, and the history of excluding people of color from leadership of the ecology movement, end quote. This is not only an issue in the United States, but is also one that extends throughout the world as logics of a particular kind of domination undergird and rationalize the exploitation of land, species, and diverse cultures in the name of expediency, profit, and so-called progress. So how and why does this matter? Well, because it's not hard to imagine increased intensity of floods, droughts, wildfires, hurricanes, extreme heat, and rising sea levels. And as I encourage folks to check out the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and the 6th assessment report for scientific data on this, because currently our global communities are being remapped with deadly repercussions for not only survival, but for our relationships to one another and the capacity, as was said by Jamie and Judy, for justice and sustainability. And this capacity hinges on seeing the interrelated ways that the environmental crisis is a cultural crisis. Okay, so what do? Support groups of people advocating for democracy, and not in ways that exclude connecting social justice, addressing racism, sexism, classism, etc., with environmental justice. These two justice movements are interrelated at a deep level, and democracy, especially versions of democracy like Vandana Shiva's Earth Democracy, can and may be our best ally in getting together to addressing this very pressing issue and asking the important question, how are we going to live and live together democratically on this planet? What environmental justice isn't, and what needs to be cautioned, is that calling attention to climate change impacts ought not to be utilized as a rationale for eco-fascism, where currently some environmentalists are calling for fascist laws and governments in response to climate change. This is just a parasitic attachment from the toxic ideology of fascism to cling to very real fears and concerns and utilize environmental arguments as a rationale to usurp democracy, take power, and sanction mass atrocity. However, I truly believe, and I have great hope that we, all of you included here, all 442 of you, can come together with all of those folks that you work and learn and do your daily activities together in a myriad of ways and ask, what does it mean for everyone? How might the decisions we are making in our jobs and habits of day-to-day life either further the unjust suffering of people, land, and diverse species and threaten the Earth's capacity to support humanity? Or how might those habits, new or sometimes old, support social justice, sustainability, and do so via democracy? If you are wondering how to do this or where to start, I highly recommend Vandana Shiva's Earth Democracy. I also recommend checking out drawdown.org. And with that, learning more about the Black Lives Matter movement, the water protectors that spoke out and took action to defend water at Standing Rock, the women-led movement in Rojava, or check out local food justice activists in Portland, Oakland, Detroit, or in any city close to you, or any of the people that are teaching us that environment is life and social justice is part of environmental justice. So I urge and ask you today, what can we do to address how our actions can and will make a difference? And then I urge you to connect with others interested in or already taking action, and just do it.
Thank you, John. I need to take a deep breath. We're going to move on to Cara and hear what she has to say.
Thank you. Well, I feel very privileged to be amongst such esteemed colleagues, and it's hard to follow those two talks up after that. I'm inspired. I am a faculty in the School of the Environment, so I teach a lot of classes on the deep connection of human health and well-being to environmental process and to environmental quality. And within that, I teach a lot about policy, you know, what kind of policy there is and how that policy is developed and how that policy is implemented and what are the impacts of that policy. And I think this is a good segue from what was said before, that, you know, development of policy has its inequities. Also, the application of policy can have a lot of inequities and injustice with how they're implemented. Particularly in climate science, or climate policy, this is an area where, you know, we need to do something, but the policies themselves can have a lot of inequities in economic injustice. You know, if we're making a policy around carbon emissions and reducing carbon emissions, this is typically going to target transportation systems and energy systems, which then, if we're using regulation or, you know, differences in markets, this all leads to increased prices in general to electricity prices or transportation prices, cars, and that gets translated down to the individual consumers. And so this is something that I think has to be addressed in all policies, is how does that policy play out in the landscape? Is it addressing the problem, but also is it leading to injustice in who's paying or how much they're paying? I mean, if you're asking a family who's already living in poverty to pay 50 cents more per kilowatt hour so that you can address climate change, that is an inequity, right? I'm also really interested in how we do collaborative decision making. So Jamie mentioned that I had worked for the William D. Ruckelshaus Center for about 4 years. I no longer work there, but during that time, I did a lot of work in collaborative process in the Spokane River Basin on a lot of really complex environmental challenge, and it was really amazing at the creative and innovative things that could come out of collaborative process. But there's a downside to that as well in how that process is designed, who's included, accessibility of those processes. They take a long time to address complex environmental challenges. You can't just do this overnight. So it takes a lot of time resources, a lot of economic resources. There's a lot of inherent trust issues already in trying to address some of these complex environmental challenges, because you have lots of different people with lots of different perspectives that have to be addressed, and you also have to address the inequities of accessibility to those decision-making processes. And ultimately, those people that are going to be impacted by those decisions should be involved, but that is very challenging because there's a lot of power dynamics in collaborative process, right? Those who are either perceived or have real authority over decisions, there's those power dynamics. There's also dynamics of who has legitimacy to make decisions and accessibility to come to meetings. You know, even in this new Zoom environment, if you don't have access to internet, that leaves you out of the loop. So I think that all of our, as we move forward, this is something we have to address. So I'll leave it at that. So thank you.
Thank you, Cara. And again, all of your pieces, your talks are just continuing to weave this web, if you will. And it'll be really great to kind of engage in just a few minutes with our Q&A section. Matthew Carroll, you're next. That's my rescued sweet dog, Bella. I'm going to let her out because she's being very noisy.
Thank you very much. I am very humbled, as Kara said of herself. I'm very humbled to be part of this group. I am not by any stretch. I think most people on this meeting have probably forgotten more about environmental justice than I'll ever know. But yet I'm interested in it, and I've tried to incorporate it into all three of the classes that I teach on a regular basis in the School of the Environment. My Society and Natural Resources class that Judy Muth made incredible contributions to over the years, a graduate class called Issues in Ethics in Natural Resource and Environment, and a Natural Resource Policy class. I've tried to incorporate some discussion of environmental justice into all of those classes. But my particular sort of introduction and burning interest in this started when I was a brand new faculty member back in '87 or '88. I met Jamie Pinkham, who was a Nez Perce. At the time, he was the forest manager for the Nez Perce. He's gone on to many other positions. And he told me the story of the Treaty of 1855 and the story of the Treaty of 1863. I realized if I'm going to be teaching natural resources and now later environmental science students on this campus, I need to know this story. I need to know who had this land and how this land was taken from them. So I've made it sort of a personal mission to learn as much as I could, particularly about the Nez Perce and to a certain extent the Palouse, because they're the ones that were locally here and on this very land. And so one of the things that I have done, I teach my Society of Natural Resources and Environment class. Essentially every student, every undergraduate in SOE has to take this class, here in Pullman at least. And I show them the film, I Will Fight No More Forever, which is the story of the War of 1877, as narrated by some wonderful historians, and most importantly by the descendants of some of the very people who were killed at Bear Paw. It's a very powerful film. I introduce it when I start talking about culture in that class, and I give the students almost no warning. But I want them to be appropriately shocked when they see the film. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the film. It tells the story of the War of 1877 in very real terms, and it then generates a lot of, I think, very productive discussions among the students in the class about the justice issues that obviously emerge from that horrendous story. One other anecdote about my contributions to the discussion. I believe it was the department chair in the department that Judy retired from a few years back. I somehow got connected with him, and we were talking about who to bring to campus for sort of comparative culture sort of a thing. And I came up with the idea to bring Billy Frank, the great Nisqually tribal leader, and Charles Wilkinson, his biographer and the great scholar of the relationships between native communities and public land management here in the United States. Bring them together for a wonderful evening of discussion. Of course, Billy Frank led the fight that led to the Bolt decision, in which the judge ultimately said that the tribes have, under the terms of the 1855 treaty, have a right to half of the anadromous fish in the Columbia system. And it was really one of the great privileges of my life to share a stage with Billy Frank, who's now left us, and with Charles Wilkinson, who's thankfully still writing wonderful books about all of this. So those have been my my contributions on campus. I'll also say one other thing. As I'm currently in the role of Associate Director for Graduate Programs in the School of the Environment. As a result of recent events that we're all aware of, there's been quite a discussion within our unit about what role should we play on campus in this whole discussion? And so we have a lecture series that's funded by a donor, and we are currently planning to have a series of what will obviously be Zoomed lectures on subjects related to environmental justice throughout this academic year. We haven't decided exactly who and exactly when, but I suspect that between now and the end of the spring semester, we will have between 4 and 6 speakers on campus, available, of course, across the campus on various topics relating to environmental justice. And we look very much forward to making those kind of contributions to our broader campus discussion on these topics.
Thank you, Matthew. Well, we are now about to move into our Q&A part of this conversation. I want to take a moment and go back to something that David Jones put into the chat. Coog's vote is also part of why we are here today. And just to remind everyone, register to vote. I'm really excited about this series. And I know that discussions, in addition to getting the vote out and helping all of us understand why it's important that we do this at this time, it's also important that we talk about how to engage if you can't vote. We have undocumented students on all our campuses. We have international students, and we are having discussions on what it means to engage your agency in other ways, to help influence, to also be part of continuing in what we like to call the work of our time. So we are going to go to some questions. Here's one right out of the gate for you. I think this is really for all of you. So whoever wants to jump in, feel free. What are some tips, ways to engage with respectful dialogue with those clinging to Trump's narrative that climate change is not real?
This is always a question I get in my class as well. This is really challenging because often when we get so embedded in one perspective, it's very hard for us to see another perspective. So if you're in that situation, it's always good to listen, ask them what they think, and sort of find commonality and build from that. I mean, that's one of the keys to collaborative process too, is break it down until you find agreement and then build from that. I mean, that's really where to start.
Can you give an example of that in that specific case, how you might do it if you were in that situation?
You might start to ask questions about environmental change in general, you know, if we're talking about climate change, and what they see happening and what they think is causing it, and sort of build from, you know, maybe not from the word climate change, I think, is a triggering term, or terms together. Global warming, all these terms tend to trigger us to, you know, jump to one side of the issue. So maybe maybe use different words, use different topics, and sort of, you know, circumvent around to where you get to that topic. But I don't know if anyone else has any other suggestions on that.
That's a big one. I think that comes up quite often. Yeah, are there other panelists that have something they'd add?
So I can relate. I'll try to be very brief. My PhD dissertation work was, I went out and lived and worked as a logger in a logging community in Siskiyou County, California, right before the spotted owl controversy came along. Yeah. And I embedded myself with that group of workers and tried to understand from the inside out, as a sociologist would, their worldview, their attachment to land, their identities attached to their work. Then that was pretty obscure research until the spotted owl controversy came along, and suddenly I was one of the few people really in the region, maybe in the country, that had ever studied logging communities at that level. And so suddenly I got drawn into President Clinton's Northwest Forest planning process. One of the things I learned throughout all of that experience is that the workers in these communities, the conflict that resulted from the fight over the disposition of the old growth Douglas fir forests in the western part of the state, in Oregon, Northern California, the way that conflict played out was seen by the people in these communities, in these occupations, as an attack on them as people, on their culture, on the hard work and the skills that they brought to the table. In other words, the conflict was more for them about what was seen as an attack on their culture, rather than about the jobs that they could potentially lose because of national forest timber becoming no longer available for harvest. And I think if you understand those kinds of rural cultures from the inside out, you can see where an appeal to sort of an anti-government, anti-elite kind of appeal can really resonate in communities like that. And I think, frankly speaking, politically for a moment, I think the Democratic Party has done a terrible job at working with that particular group of people, white working class people, and have failed to connect how the interests of white working class people are the same interests as people in the inner city. I think the party has catered to one side of that debate and not the other side of that debate, and I think the results of this now are the political divide we see. Not that I would support in any sense the politics that these people represent, but I think we have to understand where it came from.
I find that to be so very true in any of the work around issues of inequity and social justice, that it's so important to understand the narrative of the other and figure out what Carroll is saying, which is, what's the connection? We have common interest, we have common vested interest, and we need to find out what that is. Then I better understand. We have a lot of really good questions coming in, so I'm going to move on to another one. There was one, I think it got ahead because there's lots of them coming in, but one that I just saw has to do with us being a land grant institution. And as a land grant institution, what can we actually do in order to engage with this really important conversation and followed by action?
One thing that the Land Grant Institution had as its charge is to get education to the people, to better the lives of people, and to bring people to education. So it has all of that as part of its mission. Mm-hmm. And I think taking these issues, for one thing, this kind of conversation out through extension, perhaps, helping people figure out how they can be involved in their own local communities, because everywhere, think about climate change, often we call it global warming, but the effects are local. They're in our home communities, no matter where you are in the world. And so that's, everybody has a local impact or can see it coming down the road. And so taking these conversations out and thinking about who is most impacted and how we might do something about it, I think really helps people. One of the things that I've found in working with Citizens Climate Lobby is that so many times people don't get involved because they don't know how to. They don't know what they can do. They don't have an action that they can take. And I know, for one thing, Latinx environmentalists have said they feel strongly about doing something about the environment, but they have never been asked to do anything. They don't know how. They've never been involved in those conversations. And so I think in general, just getting this out to the people would be a good idea.
And recognizing that in reaching out to other communities, that there can't just be one way, right, of doing that. Right. I think there's also this way in which we normalize a very white dominated experience, and our outreach often reflects that. So I really appreciate what you just said about that. Did you want to add something, John?
Yeah, I want to just say, I think it connects a lot of these. I'm trying to keep up with the questions, and they're coming from all directions. But I see a theme, and Judy touched on this, and the other panelists have mentioned this. And I think sometimes although it's overwhelming the amount that both climate change and social injustice is part of many people's lives right now, I think at the same time, we just recenter and simplify a bit on that everybody eats, everybody breathes, and we all are bodies of water.
Yeah.
And if we care about that, and we also care about one another, we commit to that, because that's the other piece. If you don't care about one another, then you enact social injustice. Then you're okay with racism, you're okay with sexism. But if you're not, right, then you start to do the work about what does it mean to share all of these things together, and how do we rethink those relationships. And so sometimes that means connecting with, and I'll plug them because they're sponsoring this, but also because they do really great work, the Center for Civic Engagement. If you're a college student, you can reach out to them and they will help connect you. Also, most of us attending this live in a democracy, right? And what that means is the government of the people, by the people. As distant as that seems, because we're technologically mediated and social networks are telling us otherwise and getting us really divided, as Matthew pointed out, right? The more we connect with one another, and I know this is hard during COVID, but there are safe ways. Health experts are telling us the more we connect with our environment and with each other, right, in safe ways, the more we begin to build, and I don't want to over-romanticize this is important, real friendships. And they're not fake. Social media, and I'm not getting on a horse, I'm not to a high position at anti-social media, but when we make real relationships, when we listen to one another, when we disagree together, we practice respecting one another. And we practice finding those common interests. And I always tell little students all the way up through grown people, we eat, we breathe, right? We play, we do these kinds of activities and spaces together with even more than humans. The more we acknowledge those and work on those relationships, the better we get at the complexity of being in a democracy. And so you don't always need a formal invitation, but I'll sort of end on that piece, but bring humility and openness, because a lot of us, right, looking at both skin color, privilege, gender identity, all these things, have experienced the world in ways that makes it we're not so great at doing things, as Judy pointed out, equitably, right? And so we have to work on that, and together we work on that. So that's my invitation to so many of these questions, is that to ask more questions and make friends, and reach out to these panelists and to people at the CCE and to your friends to say, what can we do?
Always good to get back to what can we do and actually articulate it rather than just leave it sort of hanging out there in space. This is a really good question. I'm curious on each of the panelists' thoughts on the dire existential threat of climate change in relation to capitalism, and also the myth that technology or science will be our savior, which could mean leaving the planet. But we know that that only means for an elite white few. What alternative action might we take here and now?
Whew, that's a whole panel in itself. Okay.
It is. So we have five perspectives, or four perspectives here.
Do you want to start, John, or?
Yeah, I'll start really simply, and I kind of it can be brief because it's the same response I just gave, right? Is that I kind of function in community organizing on this level. I believe that science and science's ways of knowing of the world help us to better understand how we could live together on this planet. That is key, right? That is the premise I work from, living together on this planet. I do have friends who believe that the mission is to go to another planet. And I just don't put stock in that. That's where I sort of depart and take stock in the science that is about helping us be together on this planet. So for those working on that, cool. We've never left this planet. I don't plan on my children's children leaving this planet. And so I want to do the best work I can. That said, I really say I work locally, situationally, and in support of living systems. It's bipartisan. It's not Republican. It's not Democrat. It's not beholden to any set of rules or laws. It's about humanity and multi-species equity. And how do we live together? And that's about eating together, drinking together, right? Making sure that we're breathing in all the ways and not taking life from one another the ways our systems have been. So that's it. I simplify the whole thing, decomplexify the whole, it's capitalism, it's existential, all this. Focus on doing good in the ways we can, and it spreads.
Yeah, I agree with everything John said. That's tough to follow. I do agree it is an existential threat. I mean, climate change is real and it's happening, and we're seeing the impacts of climate change locally, regionally, nationally, and of course globally. And this is all embedded in, you know, an economic system that is based on use of resources. And I don't know that if I have an answer to how we address that, but perhaps capitalism is the way we address that, and the way we get policy that moves us forward is through a bipartisan sort of market-based approach. I don't know for sure if that will work, but if we can find some bipartisan way to do this, get people to actually talk to each other again, I think that's probably one of the biggest things. The starting points is just to start to actually listen to each other again and stop yelling at each other. I'm sure Judy has a lot more to say on bipartisan climate policy, but yeah, this is a tough one.
Yeah, for me, I start with place. You can talk to people about what is happening in your neighborhood, what is happening in your backyard, and you start the discussion from there. You can move away from that whole. I study the community impacts of wildfire, and I was telling a friend of mine who's a Trump supporter about the work, and I said one of the three things that is causing this is climate change, and there's a couple of other factors. And he said, well, we just don't believe that. So there's this. I think the way you have to have discussions with people like that is to say, well, what's happening in your backyard? What changes do you see going on in your backyard, and get away from this. The people like that tend to see science as an elitist activity that doesn't take their interests into consideration, whether it's an owl biologist or a climate scientist. They see that as an elite activity that doesn't take their personal interests into account. And so I think you really have to start from the ground up with these folks and get away from that argument about elite science, because I think that's really what climate change denial is about. It's about people seeing the scientific community as an elite that doesn't care about them.
I think every comment made by the panelists thus far on this question is really right on. And I think one of the things that comes back to me with just about any kind of change, whether it be toward environmental justice, social justice, whatever we're talking about, it's grassroots at its heart. It has to be grassroots. It has to be as inclusive as possible, and has to be local because of that, and then start there and move forward. And addressing the crisis that climate change is, I think has to happen on so many different levels. And we're going to need a lot of different solutions. We need everybody's brain involved. We need everybody's passion, everybody's specific concern, all of that in the mix. And so there are so many ways to get involved. The Palouse Citizens Climate Lobby has particular things it works on at the national level, at the regional level, at the local level. We have grassroots people from 29 different communities in just this legislative district. We have all kinds of folks involved, and that's true of so many organizations. In Washington, we have the Climate Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy. We have so many different possibilities. They're looking for different solutions, and every piece is going to fit in the puzzle to address climate change, to put more power back in people's hands and out of the hands of those right now who aren't concerned about climate change, who just want to make a buck. And we have to work in that direction.
All of that was incredibly helpful. And I have to say, that's such a daunting kind of question. So to get to hear the different perspectives really helps to pull on those threads. There's I think we have time for like one question, if I'm if I'm timing this correctly, and I'll rely on David and some of the other experts to jump in on this with time. But I think this next question is really interesting, and it goes back to some things all of you said in one way or another. This idea of equity and consequences, that oftentimes the consequences for the behavior that's really impacting or even devastating, we often don't see an equitable consequence. And so this question goes, punishing corporations by charging them fees for their mistakes or violations doesn't seem to be effective considering how much money they make. So how could we ever actually show these companies that what they're doing isn't okay? When can we move on from a slap on the wrist and actually give them consequences? What are your opinions?
Now, this comes down to the ultimate question of, do we use a regulatory approach and punishment approach, or the carrot approach and the market-based, incentivized shift things? That does sort of remove this idea of like who caused it and then who's going to fix it problem, but it may be the only way we can move forward. I don't know if which one's the right answer, but certainly the regulatory penalizing stick doesn't necessarily work all the time unless the penalties are large enough and actually realized and actually enforced. So, but typically in the United States, regulation is not something that people really love, and so it's a hard way to go on that side. But
one thing that I think that Carroll just mentioned, that market-based approach. One of the things really tricky is that if you're feeling like capitalism is the problem, and yet it may be the biggest tool we have to deal with things immediately, and we need to work on this immediately. We're going to need some overall shift in power base, but to work immediately, we need to use that system. And so if we have a market-based solution that says, yeah, let's put a price on carbon, for instance, because carbon is the most prevalent greenhouse gas right now. So let's work with that one first. And let's put a price on that such that there's a fee that's charged, but we don't want to harm anybody up with that fee. We want to give industry a signal, a chance to say, carbon's going to get more expensive. It is right now, but it's going to get much more expensive. And they're going to start investing because they want to make money on this. They don't want to lose. They're going to start investing in all sorts of clean energy. They're going to build solar farms. They're going to build wind farms. They're going to find out, what's the best technology and hire the best scientists to work on that. So you've got that incentive away from carbon fuels, and you could protect people by taking the money from the fee and turning right around and giving it back to all the households in America, that people don't suffer a hit. Individuals don't suffer a hit. Households don't suffer a hit. And what we see is just this pretty quick change, because business likes predictability. It likes to understand what's coming down the pike. And if it knows that price is going to get more expensive all the time, that's an enormous incentive for them to turn their operation around toward clean energy.
So I guess I also, as I'm listening to that, think, but marketization of everything is what got us here. So it's really a struggle for me,
I know,
yes.
Right? Exactly.
Because we're marketizing education, we marketize,
right.
And we also have a class of people who are disposable people.
That's right.
Disposable children. Right. So anyway, John, I know you have something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, similar to what you said, Jamie, is just, to echo in here a bit on in some of our questions that are coming in the Q&A have acknowledged this, the immense amount of privilege, and Matthew noted this too, the elite position of the kinds of technological fixes that often come up in a liberal discussion are really problematic to exploitation of historically, or even right now, we might call it like the global South, or this disposable population, a labor class of people who are seen as less than, and it's highly problematic. It's like, you can't talk social justice and technological solution that requires, children doing mining in other countries to get these materials to do this. So we're in a bind. It's a messy one. And I just plugged this part again, like market-based solutions need to be liberated from capitalism. Absolutely. The economics does not have to be exploitive. Capitalism is,
No.
right? And that democracy is a way of organizing decision making that is conducive to supporting environmental and social justice. It's its essence, decisions being made by those impacted by the decision being made. It's always a way of organizing locally, situationally, and ought to be in support of living systems, but that starts and ends with all of us. And like I say, all of us, it means across the planet and across species, because a lot of these fixes that are market-based proposed or punishments are all rooted in the exploitation of something. So got to get away from logic of domination. And that way of living is out there. It is not a popular majority on the planet to live in exploitation. Mutual aid prevails in humankind. It's just politically not practiced as empowered.
Clearly with the passion that is around this question, and I think it reflects just how loaded, right, it is. And as we begin to really look at that, I always want to operate from, okay, let's build from something. And if this is what's gonna, it used to be make the business case for diversity, right? I spent time doing that for a while, and there are moments where we use those tools. So I want to also acknowledge that, you know, what Kara and Judy were acknowledging as far as, you know, how do we work with what's present right now and build off of that, and maybe we work through the process and dismantling and so on. So I know we're out of time. I don't know if this is my first time facilitating something like this. There he is. I was going to say, I think David will send us out into the evening.
Thanks, Jamie. We will wrap up. We are starting to lose students, and I feel a little awkward chiming in with just administrative stuff, but I know this is a question on a lot of students' mind. In order to have this tracked by the Center for Civic Engagement, those of you who are participating will receive an email. You may have received it right now at 5, but you'll get sent an email shortly. Just click that link and hit submit or add